Hey, all right, number 3. I'm on a roll, right? So I have been reading today How to Read a Film by James Monaco. I'll put it in the description in case anyone ever watches this and needs to buy it. I myself don't need it in the description because I've got it. I would say it's a fairly important text. It's a perfect primer for film theory, film study, I would say, if you've never done it before. It was a core text on the MA I did. Yes, it was on the MA. And I read it cover to cover, which is quite rare for actually reading an academic text for me, because it's never a fun task to do that. It's better to just cherry pick the chapters that sound appropriate. But this was a good read, an interesting read. And for me, it was particularly good because I had about a 10-year gap between my undergrad and my master's. So it was a good chance to really brush up on everything that I've been told years ago and had practiced without really thinking about. It's really thorough. It goes through a lot of film theory and how to deal with it. Another good one as well, actually, another primer text would be this one, The Story of Film by Mark Cousins. I would say that's a bit more kind of pop sciencey, in the idea that it's a bit more accessible to everyone without a film background. I would say it's very much a history of film, but quite accessibly written and very well illustrated throughout, and introduces a lot of core ideas in film theory. Whereas the Monaco text, this one, is a bit denser and a bit more heavy on the theory side, and as I'll be discussing in a moment, in some cases, I think a little bit presumptuous about the audience. I think it's not very accessible in some of its writing. In some places, it makes some assumptions about people's knowledge. But I decided to give this a go today again, based on yesterday's video on reading an article about before YouTube. I thought it would be a good time, a good space in my mind right now to read about before YouTube, about the study of actual film language, of cinema language, and not to read about YouTube at all, but to think about what came before, to think about the theories that are out there that aren't concerned with where we are now. Monaco's book was written relatively recently. On the cover, it's got a shot from Lost in Translation, so it's at least within the 2000s. There we are, 2009. Which actually dates it at a similar time as that article I read yesterday. I think that was 2009 as well. But it's quite well focused on cinema, and he references a lot of old texts from cinema theory, early cinema theory, and a lot of the stills and examples given are from very classic cinema. We've got like von Sydow and Hitchcock and Ingmar Bergman. We deal with directors like that quite a lot in this book, of very quite serious and well talked about film pioneers, I suppose. So the chapter I focused on, I didn't go for cover to cover this time. I feel like I've already done that, so I can not do that again. I decided to look through for something specifically talking about language in this book. And the third chapter is all about the language of film, signs and syntax. And it's actually split in half in the chapter. One half for signs, one half for syntax, which we'll get to explaining. Today, I just read the portion on signs, and I'm going to be reading this portion on syntax next. The difference between signs and syntax, to be very basic about it, there is obviously a lot more detail here. It's an entire chapter, but a sign would be a visual item that we experience that has meaning connected to it, whether that meaning is literal, denotative, or has an ascribed meaning that can be interpreted by the observer or constructed by the author. And in fact, Monaco talks about the triangle of participation here, in which the observer and the creator and the text itself are a triumvirate of meaning makers. And in fact, not one of those three things gets to say what the meaning is. It relies on all three parts to construct and deconstruct meaning. So the signs are the basic I would say, visual in terms of cinema, although audio as well. Building blocks of those images and those meanings that you can get. Syntax would be more about how they're constructed together and how meaning can be changed by placing them in sequence. Montage, essentially, is what we're talking about. If it was a literary equivalent and we're talking about just a written word, a word would be a sign, sort of, and a sentence would be the syntax, how those words are put together in order. A sentence can be swapped around a lot, and so can montage, and it changes meaning as you do that. But that's syntax, and that's the next bit of discussion. For now, we're going to focus on signs. The writing, the way Monaco constructs a chapter, I found myself disagreeing with a lot of it, which I don't remember doing the first time I read this work. I think the reason being is that I obviously have read not just this book, but a lot of texts since. I've studied film in much more detail since reading this, and what I found is going through this book with a pre-existing knowledge of film theory is quite frustrating, because Monaco's style is to say things quite didactically, to introduce what a sign is and to say this is a sign and that's all it means, but then build on that. So it'll go from signs can only in cinema denote what they mean. They can only show you a thing, and that is what that thing means. A rose is a rose. That's the example Monaco gives. Monaco talks about this rose quite a lot in this chapter. A rose is a rose is a rose. That's it. But then Monaco goes on to build it out and introduce concepts, which, if you're being introduced to film theory for the first time, is very useful. So the disagreements I have, I think possibly are addressed later on in the book, which makes this difficult for me to discuss. So immediately I disagreed with a sentence early in this chapter. It's impossible to be ungrammatical in film language. Monaco says, I think possibly that was actually a quote from another theorist, Christian Metz, who we're going to discuss in a moment, because Monaco draws on Metz quite a lot, and there's some fantastic stuff there. If it's not a quote from Metz, it's something that Monaco draws from Metz's ideas. I'm not going to look that up now. I didn't note that very well. I will double check that. But I disagreed with the idea that it's impossible to be ungrammatical in film, because I think film has an established grammar. The cinema has an established grammar. It's possible to change that grammar and to reinvent it in ways that work. But I would argue that it's also entirely possible to be ungrammatical. It is possible to make a film people will reject. This is not a good film. You disobeyed what a film should do in terms of structure, in terms of grammar. If you placed a shot of something exploding and then a shot of a bomb ticking down, that would be very confusing. Maybe, hopefully, there's a reason for that particular sequence of shots, but logically, the bomb ticking down goes before the explosion. You've broken grammar and you've broken time, in fact, by doing it that way around. That's a very, very, very basic and crude example of breaking grammar, and there are much more complex ideas around that. For example, framing a shot, I would say maybe that is impossible to be ungrammatical. There are bad ways to frame a shot, and you will receive criticism if you just sloppily frame your shot without rhyme or reason, but it's not breaking linguistical understanding in theory. As long as everything in the frame is represented as it needs to be for that film's context, then I guess there's nothing grammatically incorrect about that. Another disagreement I found myself with is that cinema doesn't have a metaphorical language. Again, this is something that Monaco then actually goes on to refute themselves and to sort of describe around, although never actually says explicitly, therefore film does have a metaphorical language. Never does Monaco actually retract on a previous sentence and say, actually, I've refuted that now. Monaco kind of just gives you one sentence and then builds on that and tells you new information, which is kind of fine, but a little confusing. I would say that cinema absolutely has a metaphorical language. A rose, to go back to that again, has a lot of metaphors around it, quite clearly. A rose is a symbol of romance, perhaps. A rose is dangerous and spiky and thorny, and these are things that Monaco actually says later on as well, about how a rose can be framed in different ways to give it different meanings. One thing throughout this whole section on signs at least. Perhaps in syntax it's going to be different, but in signs, Monaco never talks about the idea of narrative context. Context is discussed a little bit, and towards the end of the section, tropes are as well, which I think are particularly important when we start thinking about YouTube. But narrative context never gets a mention. A rose can be a very strong metaphor depending on the narrative. Maybe it's a weapon. Maybe someone made a threat and about, I don't know, a particular weapon that they have access to called the rose, and then they leave an actual rose where the person they made the threat to can find it. The actual rose is not the weapon. It's a metaphor for the weapon because it shares a name. But that's now a metaphor based on narrative context. There are thousands, millions, an infinite number of ways you can create narrative metaphors like that. And I'm sure Monaco appreciates that and talks about that later, because otherwise that seems like a huge misstep. However, in this short section on signs, it's not mentioned. Narrative context, I would expand when we start thinking about YouTube, but I mean, we can go backwards before YouTube and think about things like documentary, non-narrative pieces. Those metaphors will still exist without strictly a narrative. They exist within, let's call it a context, a trope context, perhaps. So when we see particular things happening on screen, they happen on screen for a reason. They don't just show us an image that has the image at its core and signifies nothing else. It comes from a place where that image means something particular to the context it's in. And I would say, regardless of what Monaco's going to say in the next bit on syntax, it's regardless of syntax, it's regardless of that sentence construction of cinema. It's purely a metaphor based on context. YouTube allows individual pieces of work to be uploaded to a larger body of work. A channel has multiple videos, but anyone can watch one single video without watching the entire channel. That places context in there. If you watch a channel of a vlogger who is interested in bodybuilding, in fitness, but you only ever watch one video of that person, perhaps they do this thing where they pose and flex for the camera. But it's like this stylized shot, this freeze frame moment, and it's got a particular sound attached to it. Even if you're watching that for the first time and you've never watched their channel before, just from it being on YouTube, you have a contextual awareness that this is probably some kind of trope, some kind of signature or moment or thing that happens in this YouTuber's videos. This has meaning beyond just look at my muscles, because it's been presented in such a way that makes it feel like it has meaning. You don't need to know the grammar of the YouTube video it features in, of the one video. It doesn't need to appear in one particular place in that video. The moment it happens, the context around it decides for us what it means. And I would say, actually, I need to go back into Monaco's book and find exactly the writing on this triangle mentioned about observer, creator, and text, all contributing to meaning. But I would suggest that actually a moment like that kind of trumps those things. It kind of comes from the text and the creator. Yes, it requires those too, but the observer doesn't really get a say into what that means. Maybe they're constructing a further meaning around how they feel about that person doing that thing. Maybe they're constructing a meaning about, oh, this is a meme, and maybe it's not a meme. Maybe they're constructing another meaning, which then actually says this triangle is correct there. But from a very objective standpoint, or as objective as you can be with a subject like this, that is really dictated. It's a moment in a visual language which has a meaning that is prescribed. And if that person who has never seen anything else on that person's channel then tries to tell other people, this is what that shot meant, this shot meant that person's vain and that their channel is full of vain things, but they've never seen anything else on the channel. Anyone else who has seen any other part of this person's channel and knows more about it and has seen that shot repeated in other videos is able to refute that, is able to actually say what that shot means quite objectively based on a body of work, based on a situation where that shot is repeated and repeated and repeated and used as a trope, which I think is one of the real strengths of YouTube, and maybe one of the areas I'm going to end up looking at quite a lot, the idea of repeated tropes in particular bodies of work. Cinema language gets to use tropes that exist in cinema culture and wider art culture and human culture. It gets to find societal memes and use them. It gets to use a shorthand for expression by saying, well, here's the thing everyone understands. If a guy cocks a gun, he's probably going to shoot it. That simple. But a YouTube channel, one single creator, gets to create a moment where a visual cue will happen. And I'm going to try and find an example of this because I know there's something rattling at the back of my brain about this. But they get to create one particular visual moment or audio moment or just moment in general in a video and repeat that moment ad lib, ad infinitum, in other videos and decide and prescribe what it means just by its repetition, just by making it become a trope of their videos. By having access to multiple pieces of work, they get to actually create language. That's going to bring me quite nicely onto a fantastic quote in this little section I read. It's a quote from Metz, Christian Metz, and this is a book I'm going to buy because I need to read it. So I'm going to look that up next. But the quote here, I'll read it in full first. So when a language does not already exist, one must be something of an artist to speak it, however poorly. For to speak it is partly to invent it, whereas to speak the language of every day is simply to use it. So what Metz is saying is that a language that not everyone necessarily speaks, i.e. film language, because we are never trained in film language, we never learn film language as such, just by living our lives. Maybe we just watch cinema, but we never necessarily engage with it. Some of us do, some of us don't. Whereas the language you speak and write with, you have to engage with to make yourself heard in the way you want to be heard. To express yourself fully, you need to do it. So what Metz is saying is if this language isn't a prescribed language with a set of very hard rules, if you are speaking it, if you're trying to speak it and you don't even necessarily know how to speak it, you're also contributing to inventing the language. So to branch off in two directions from that thought, first of all, with the thing I was talking about, tropes, if you're inventing a trope, you're very directly and intentionally creating part of language for YouTube or for your medium. You are saying, here's a thing, this is now got meaning attached to it. It's like inventing a word in the language you speak. If I was to create an English word that had never existed before and then told everyone this is what it means, and many authors get to do this when they write fantasy. I mean, let's take Harry Potter. Quidditch isn't a word that many people used before, and now suddenly we all know it's a sport played on broomsticks with several positions you can play on the field and different things you can hit or avoid, or not to go too far into that. But you get to, by doing that with a word in a language, by saying this is now a word in English, that's going to take a lot of work and it requires an audience to agree to that. However, doing it in a medium doesn't require an audience for it to become language. You've invented it. Whether or not your audience sees it, this now exists as language because it's there and it happens. And if anyone does come across this, they have to be able to interpret it, and maybe they'll get a different interpretation from it. But that strength of tropes means you get to reassert it and reassert it and reassert it. So you get to say, this is what that means. This is not open for interpretation. Here's clearly what that means. Maybe someone's going to come along and say, well, in the wider context, if we look at every time you've done that, actually it coincides symbolically with this idea, and maybe they'll flex it and change it a little bit. But now we're back into that area where that requires an audience and requires a larger understanding. If someone wants to change what your language means, now an audience is required, whereas creating that language in the first place, that was up to you. J.K. Rowling got to say Quidditch is a word, which means this sport with all these things, but it didn't enter any kind of popular lexicon until Harry Potter was widely accepted. In terms of YouTube language, it's not going to enter a wider lexicon of cinematic language unless a lot of people suddenly have this visual idea of this trope, that this is what this means. However, the idea of a trope, the idea of something repeating and asserting itself, is itself a form of language. It's a sign that someone is creating a language. And I'm kind of babbling now and going around in circles in my head. I'm losing track of our thoughts. So let's move on to the second point of what that quote from Metz really gets to the heart of. Speaking the language of everyday is simply to use it. I grew up speaking English. I learned to read and write in English. At no point in that process did I create English. Again, if I'm a very popular author or personality, maybe I get to invent a word or two here and there that people will eventually use, but probably not. But I am a filmmaker, and I've shot film, and I've seen things I liked and recreated them, and I've had original ideas and thought, no, I'm going to do that because that's a good idea. I got to create language in ways that the language of everyday, for me, English, didn't really allow me. I got to use my artistic expression to say signs and symbols are there for me to wield and to manage in ways I would like to say anything. One last thing I'm going to mention at the end of this video, and the reason I'm leaving it to the end is because I feel like I'm missing something in my knowledge here, is the idea of connotation and denotation. Very, very quickly, if I haven't already in this video, denotation is the idea that the thing you see, I'm going to just speak about a visual language here. Denotation is the idea that something you see literally means the thing that you see. Connotation means that the thing that you see holds extra meanings and means something else. So let's go back to the rose. I see a rose, it denotes a rose. I see a picture of a rose, that's a rose. That's it. Connotation, I see a picture of a rose and I get the sense of romance and Valentine's Day, for example, just to be really easy about it. Romance and Valentine's Day are not in the picture I'm looking at. There is no single thing there that says the word or a language that irrefutably means romance. A rose could mean something else to someone else, but it's able to convey those thoughts and those meanings. Now, the thing I want to say here about where my gap might lie, but I have read about connotation and denotation a few times and don't remember coming across this, is denotation itself. Denotation seems to be lacking a level when it's discussed in terms of cinema, at least. I don't know if other art forms have this problem, but denotation says, if I look at, I'm going to use alien here because this is the thing that made me think about this problem. If I look at a picture of an astronaut looking at an alien egg, that is what I'm looking at. I'm looking at an astronaut looking at an alien egg. And then the connotations of that are danger and suspense and foreignness and intrigue and mystery and all sorts of connotations can come from that. What's this astronaut going to do with that? I'm thinking a little bit too emotionally for connotation here. Like, I don't know, that's an alien egg. They're looking at a shape. It's a shape like that, but it connotes egg. It's egg-shaped. It's got this sense of being an egg. There are many of them in this particular scene. If you haven't seen Alien, then maybe go watch that. However, the problem I have with denotation as the way it's described is that actually, no, that's not what I'm looking at. That's not what I see in this image. What I see in this image is an actor wearing a spacesuit on a set covered in mist, lit kind of blue from memory, with some large egg-like shapes out in front of them. Denotation doesn't seem to get discussed in a very metatextual sense. It doesn't seem to get discussed in the sense that actually the thing I'm looking at isn't the narrative thing I'm looking at, but it's the actual thing I'm looking at. I think there are two levels of denotation. There's physical denotation. I'm looking at actors on a screen doing a thing. And there's narrative or contextual denotation. I'm looking at an astronaut looking at an egg. So I'm going to try and see if I can find anything anywhere that talks about that kind of denotation, in that contextual denotation. And I think that also feeds back into this YouTube idea, because when I'm looking at a vlogger, am I looking at a person talking into a camera, or am I looking at a character talking to an audience? There's the difference I'm thinking there. I'm thinking about the higher end vloggers, the real popular sorts that have their tropes and their memes and their personas. Let's, like, again, Davey504 or PewDiePie or something like that. Am I looking at that actual person as they are and they're just staring at a camera? Or am I looking at this personality they've created and they're talking to me as an audience. Denotation definitely has a split level there. Okay, these videos are getting longer and longer every time I do one. So I'm going to end this here, and I'm going to go away and probably not do one for a couple of days because this is getting a bit much now.